Deck Officer Matthias Fohl found his brother in the port observation gallery, weeping against the shuttered viewport. The problem was his brother had been dead for 17 years, buried in the ash fields of Krieg. The second problem was the observation shutters had been welded shut since they entered the warp 4 hours ago. Fohl stood there, heart hammering against his ribs, watching his brother's shoulders shake with sobs that made no sound. The emergency lumens bathed everything in the color of old blood. When his brother turned, tears ran down that familiar face, except they weren't tears. They hissed when they hit the deck plating. They left burn marks in the steel. His brother's mouth opened, and Fohl heard his voice, but the words came backwards, syllables reversing like a Vox recording played in the wrong direction. Then came the smile, too wide, too many teeth, white and sharp and going all the way back. The hand reached out. Fohl ran. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. Ran past bulkheads he'd walked 1,000 times and bulkheads that shouldn't exist. Ran through corridors that twisted in ways no shipwright had ever designed. When he finally collapsed, gasping recycled air that tasted like copper and burning insulation, he looked up. Port observation gallery. Same shuttered viewport. Same emergency lumens painting everything red. The chrono above the hatchway read 03407, exactly the same time it had read when he first arrived. He'd been running for what felt like an hour. He hadn't moved at all. His brother was gone, but Fohl could still smell that acrid stench where the knot tears had burned into the deck. The marks were there, smoking, real. He spent the next 3 hours curled against the bulkhead, shaking, while something laughed behind the sealed shutters. The laughter didn't sound like his brother. It didn't sound like anything human. It sounded like glass breaking underwater, like metal screaming under stress, like the sound a throat makes when it tears. Fohl had served in the Imperial Navy for 12 years. He'd fought orcs and faced down Tyranid bioships and stood his ground when plasma conduits ruptured and filled the corridor with fire. None of it had prepared him for the simple horror of hearing something that wore his brother's face laugh at his terror from behind 3 meters of reinforced steel. Nobody talks about what the warp does to you before it kills you. The Immaterium propaganda shows proud warships sailing the Immaterium, crews standing at attention, faith absolute, the Emperor's light guiding them through the darkness. What they don't show is Fohl scrubbing his brother's burn marks from the deck with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, or the rating who screamed herself hoarse in the medic bay because she could feel something growing inside her skull, pressing against the inside of her forehead like a child pushing against a womb. They don't mention Tech Priest Delta 79 who started, whispering binary cant that translated to prayers in a language that predated human civilization by 60 million years. The Mechanicus excommunicated him, scraped his brain, recycled his augmetics. His servitor shell still works the plasma conduits on sea deck. Sometimes it weeps oil from empty eye sockets. The other servitors avoid it when they can, their limited consciousness recognizing something wrong even when their programming insists everything is nominal. Sometimes the weeping servitor stops its work and turns its head toward crew members passing by, tracking them with sensors that should be inactive. And the crew members hurry past because they swear they can feel it watching them with eyes it doesn't have anymore. The Geller field hums in the walls like a dying thing. Every crewman knows that sound, that awful resonant drone that vibrates in your teeth and your bones and the meat of your brain. It's supposed to be comforting, that hum. It means the field is active, means real space still has some claim on the ship, means the nightmares stay on the other side of the barrier. Except the barrier is a lie, not a strong lie, not even a particularly good lie. It's a desperate assertion of reality powered by plasma coils and prayer, and the warp knows it. The warp presses itself against that translucent membrane between dimensions and watches the humans inside, like a child watches ants burning under a magnifying glass. Patient, curious, hungry. The tech priests who maintain the Geller field generators work in shifts that never exceed 4 hours because longer exposure to the machinery causes psychological degradation that manifests as religious ecstasy or suicidal depression with no middle ground. They stand in the cathedral-sized chamber where the generators spin, massive rings of blessed steel inscribed with prayers in 7,000 languages, and they feel the warp pressing against the other side. They feel it like pressure in their sinuses, like weight on their chest, like hands on their throat that tighten incrementally, so slowly you don't notice until you're already choking. Crewman Helena Vess felt it on her 3rd shift after translation. Something touched the back of her neck, cold fingers that left no marks but made her skin crawl for the next 6 hours. She reported it to her section chief, who logged it as a minor psychological event, acceptable losses, standard warp exposure. The next shift, the fingers came back. They traced the line of her spine through her uniform, gentle and methodical, like a lover's touch or a coroner's examination. She spun around. Empty corridor, emergency lumens, recycled air, nothing. The shift after that, the fingers slid into her hair, gripped tight, pulled her head back until her neck strained. She felt breath on her throat, cold and rotten, smelling of meat left too long in the sun. When she looked in the mirror later, there were no marks. Her hair wasn't even mussed, but she could still feel those fingers, still smell that breath. She started sleeping with the lights on. Then she started not sleeping at all. Her bunkmate, a woman named Torrens, who'd served on 6 previous warp voyages, told her it was normal, that everyone experienced phantom touches during transit, that the trick was acknowledging them without giving them power. Vess tried. She really tried. But the fingers kept coming back, and each time they were more insistent, more real, pressing harder, gripping tighter, and she started to wonder if they were phantoms at all, or if something had actually gotten inside the ship and was visiting her every shift, learning her, studying her, deciding whether she was worth taking. Time stopped being reliable somewhere around day 4. Engineer Cole went down to the plasma drives for an 8-hour maintenance shift. When he came back, his beard had grown 6 inches and his nails were cracked and yellow, like he hadn't trimmed them in months. The chrono insisted he'd been gone 8 hours and 14 minutes. His body insisted otherwise. He filed a report. Tech Priest Designate reviewed the cogitators, found no temporal anomalies, marked the incident as crew fatigue, prescribed stims. Cole went back down to the plasma drives the next day. He didn't come back at all. They found him 3 weeks later when they made port at Cipra Mundi. He was welded inside the coolant manifold, body compressed and twisted in ways that should have killed him, should have been impossible given the space available. But he was alive, conscious. He'd been in there for 8 hours, according to the chrono. He'd been in there for 17 years, according to the beard that filled the entire manifold cavity and the fingernails that had grown long enough to curl like ram's horns. When they cut him out, he wouldn't stop talking about the woman he'd married down there in the dark, the children she'd given him, the life he'd lived inside 3 cubic meters of steel. He described his wife in detail that made the Medicae uncomfortable, spoke about her smile and her voice, and the way she'd held him during the long, cold nights when the plasma drive cycled down. He named his children, told stories about their first words and first steps, wept when he realized they weren't waiting for him, that they'd never existed outside the time-dilated hell of that manifold. The Medicae lasered the beard off, trimmed the nails, put him in restraints. He died screaming about his wife, begging them to let him go back, swearing she was real. She was real. She was waiting for him. They burned his body in the plasma core. His personnel file was marked as warp casualty, standard temporal displacement, acceptable losses. Nobody mentioned the wedding ring they'd found welded to his finger, a band of metal that had grown into his flesh over 17 years that had never happened. The dead started showing up around day 5. Not everyone saw them, which somehow made it worse. Gunner's mate. Petter saw his mother in the mess hall, sitting at the table where he always sat, wearing her good dress, the one she'd been buried in. She smiled at him. He sat down across from her, and they had a conversation about nothing important. Small talk. The weather on the agri-world where he'd grown up, how the grain harvest had been last season. She asked about his work. He told her about the macro cannons, about the loading procedures, about the other gunners in his crew. She listened like she always had, patient and attentive, nodding in the right places. Then she reached across the table and touched his hand, and her fingers went through his skin like he wasn't there. He felt them inside his wrist, cold and wet, sliding between the bones. She kept smiling. She kept talking. Her fingers rooted around inside his arm like she was looking for something she'd lost. When she pulled her hand back, there was no wound, no blood, just the memory of violation and his mother's smile, and the taste of copper flooding his mouth. He never saw her again. He stopped eating in the mess hall. He stopped eating at all, mostly. His crew noticed he was losing weight, that his uniform hung loose on his frame, that his hands shook when he loaded the macro cannon shells. They noticed, but they said nothing because everyone was seeing things. Everyone was breaking in small ways, and you didn't report your crewmates unless you wanted to be next on the list for the commissar's attention. 3 weeks after they made port, Peter put his service pistol in his mouth and pulled the trigger. The suicide note said he could still feel her fingers inside his arm, said they were moving deeper, said they'd reached his shoulder and soon they'd reach his heart. The note said when they reached his heart, he'd become what she was, and he couldn't let that happen. Couldn't let himself be worn like a suit by the thing that had touched him in the mess hall. The commissar read the note, burned it, and filed a report listing cause of death as equipment malfunction. Acceptable losses. Voices leaked through the Vox network like poison through cracked pipes. Navigator aspirant Thessia heard them first, her psychic sensitivity making her a lightning rod for every whisper and echo that bled through the ship's communications. She heard conversations that hadn't happened yet, arguments that wouldn't start for another 3 days, confessions that crew members would never actually make, but thought about making in their darkest moments. She heard her own voice ordering the execution of the entire Navigator's spire, heard herself laughing while she did it, heard the captain begging her to stop. None of it had happened. All of it felt true. She started filing reports, detailed logs of every precognitive conversation, every temporal echo, every voice that shouldn't exist. The master of Vox reviewed her reports with increasing concern, not because he thought she was wrong, but because some of the conversations she'd logged had actually happened, word for word, days before she reported hearing them. She wasn't hearing echoes. She was hearing the future bleeding backwards through the warp, and the future was screaming. The master of Vox brought his concerns to the captain, who ordered Thessia confined to her quarters pending psychiatric evaluation. She went peacefully, thanked them for their concern, spent the next 18 hours in isolation listening to Vox chatter that came through walls that had no Vox equipment, voices discussing her fate in bureaucratic detail, clinical assessments of her mental state delivered in tones that suggested she was already dead. When they came to check on her, she'd scratched words into the walls with her fingernails, predictions written in blood from torn nail beds, dates and times and events that wouldn't happen for weeks or months or years. Most of it was incomprehensible. Some of it came true. The captain ordered the quarters sealed and reassigned. Nobody was told what happened to Thessia. The official record listed her as transferred to another vessel. Crew members who'd known her swore they sometimes heard her voice in the Vox network, warning them about things that were about to happen, always too late to prevent them, always accurate enough to confirm she was still out there somewhere, trapped in a timeline that kept moving while she stayed frozen in the moment they'd sealed her quarters. The ship's architecture started disagreeing with itself around day 7. Hatchway 7 Beta 4 opened into a storage locker containing spare parts for the port torpedo tubes. It had always opened into that locker. Every schematic, every data slate, every crew member's memory confirmed it. Except when able rating Torrens opened that hatchway on his way to his shift, he found himself standing in a cathedral, vaulted ceilings stretching up into darkness that no lumen could pierce. Stained glass windows depicting saints he'd never seen, their faces melting and reforming like wax, their mouths open in silent screams or rapturous prayer, or both simultaneously. Pews carved from some black stone that drank the light, stretching back into infinity. He stood in the doorway, 1 foot in the corridor, 1 foot in the cathedral, brain refusing to process the contradiction. Behind him, the ship's corridor, narrow and cramped and real. In front of him, impossible space, sacred and profane and completely wrong. The air in the cathedral was cold and smelled like incense and rot, and he could hear singing, thousands of voices raised in hymns he didn't recognize, words in languages that hurt his ears. He stepped back, sealed the hatch, logged the incident. His section chief sent a repair team to investigate. They opened the hatchway and found the storage locker exactly as it should be, spare torpedo parts racked and cataloged. Torrens filed a secondary report. The Medicae prescribed antipsychotics. 3 days later, Torrens opened his bunk, locker, and found his childhood bedroom inside, walls covered in faded paint and old memories. His mother's voice calling him down for dinner. He climbed inside. The locker door sealed behind him. Nobody ever saw him again. When they finally forced the locker open, they found his uniform folded neatly on a bed that shouldn't fit inside a space that small. The uniform smelled like home-cooked food and flowers, and something rotten underneath. His data slate was there too. Final entry dated 3 years in the future, describing a life he'd lived in that bedroom, days and months and years, compressed into the seconds between climbing into the locker and the door sealing shut. The entry ended mid-sentence, and the blood spatter on the wall suggested he'd realized what was happening right before it finished with him. Navigator Karen Vass had sailed the warp for 43 years. She'd seen things that would shatter lesser minds, stared into the roiling madness of the Immaterium with her third eye wide and bleeding, charted courses through impossible currents, while demonic entities tried to claw their way inside her skull. She was strong. She was trained. She was prepared for anything the warp could show her. Except on day 8, when she opened her third eye to check their heading, she saw the Emperor. Not the glorious vision the ecclesiarchy promised, not the shining God presence that guided humanity through the darkness. She saw what he actually was, a corpse sitting on a throne of gold and lies, skin withered to parchment, eyes that had stopped seeing anything real 10,000 years ago. Power leaked from him like pus from a wound, psychic energy bleeding into the warp in torrents that fed and sustained and empowered things that wore his face, while laughing at the joke of it all. She saw the truth beneath the imperial cult, saw the machinery keeping him alive while he rotted, saw the souls fed into the Astronomicon every day to keep the corpse god's lighthouse burning. She saw and she understood, and understanding broke something fundamental inside her mind. The vision kept coming, kept forcing itself into her consciousness, showing her layer after layer of horrible truth. She saw that the Emperor had been dying since the heresy, saw that every prayer sent his way fed something that wasn't him anymore, saw that the Imperium worshipped a corpse, while demons danced in the psychic overflow. She saw that humanity had built 10,000 years of faith on a foundation of rot and desperation. And the foundation was crumbling, had always been crumbling, would continue crumbling until nothing remained but the laughter of thirsting gods. When they found her in the meditation chamber, she was clawing at her own face, trying to dig the third eye out with her fingers, screaming that she'd seen him, really seen him, and he was already dead and had been dead forever, and everything humanity believed was a lie built on a grave. The Medicae sedated her. The commissar interviewed her. She told him everything, every detail of the vision, every layer of horrible revelation. He listened carefully, took notes. Then he put his bolt pistol against her temple and executed her for heresy. Her body was burned in the plasma core. Her name was struck from the ship's records. The Navigator spire received a replacement within the week. A young woman who'd never met Karen Vass, but who sometimes woke screaming from dreams, where an old navigator showed her things she didn't want to see, truths she didn't want to know, visions of the Emperor as he really was behind the cathedral facade. The paranoia started small and spread like cancer through the crew. Able Seaman Drust noticed his bunkmate didn't blink anymore, just stared with eyes that had gone flat and glassy like a doll's eyes. He mentioned it to Petty Officer Harkon, who admitted he'd been watching that same bunkmate for 3 days now, timing the intervals between breaths, counting heartbeats, and the numbers were wrong. Too slow, too regular, like something was operating the body manually, following a script of how humans were supposed to function, but getting the details slightly off. They brought their concerns to the bosun, who listened carefully and then revealed he'd been keeping his own list of crew members who didn't quite move right anymore, whose shadows fell at wrong angles, whose reflections in polished steel showed faces that didn't match the originals. By the end of the day, half the section was convinced the other half had been replaced by something wearing human skin. By the end of the week, 3 people were dead, beaten to death by crew members who swore they could see the tentacles growing from their backs, the extra mouths opening in their throats, the wrongness leaking from every pore. The Medicae examined the bodies. Human, completely human, no mutations, no taint, just flesh and blood and the trauma of blunt force applied with religious fervor. The commissar investigated, found no evidence of possession, executed the perpetrators anyway because paranoia is contagious, and the only cure is fear of consequences more immediate than demonic infiltration. The executions were public. The crew watched their crewmates die for killing their crewmates, and everyone understood that they were all one suspicion away from the bolt pistol, all one wrong move away from being declared tainted whether they were or not. The paranoia didn't decrease. It just went underground, festering in silence, growing in the spaces between words, manifesting as crew members who walked with weapons drawn and backs to walls, who tested their food for poison that wasn't there, who accused their own reflections of being imposters and shattered every mirror they could find. Tech Priest designation Sigma 12 documented everything with mechanical precision. Temporal anomalies, 743 logged incidents, Spatial disruptions, 218. Confirmed cases of impossible architecture. Psychological breaks, 4,912 individuals exhibiting symptoms ranging from minor hallucinations to complete catatonia. Deaths by violence, 87 confirmed, 12 disputed, 23 pending investigation. Deaths by suicide, 104 confirmed. Deaths by unexplained causes, 61, including engineer Cole, navigator aspirant Thessia, and 17 crew members who simply stopped existing mid-shift. No bodies, no evidence, just empty uniforms and the lingering smell of ozone. Sigma 12 filed these reports with the Fabricator General's office on Mars, adding them to the vast statistical archives that tracked warp exposure across the Imperial Navy. The numbers were consistent with previous voyages. All metrics fell within acceptable parameters. The machine continued because the machine must continue, and individual suffering was irrelevant when measured against the grinding necessities of the Imperium. Sigma 12 understood this, accepted this, found comfort in the cold mathematics of acceptable losses, except sometimes, late in the ship's night cycle when the corridors were empty and the only sound was the hum of the Geller field dying in the walls, Sigma 12 would stand before the cogitator displays and add up the numbers differently. Not crew lost per voyage, but souls broken per year. Not acceptable losses measured against strategic value, but human beings destroyed, measured against nothing, because there was no metric that made the numbers acceptable when you stopped thinking of them as statistics and started thinking of them as people. Sigma 12 never filed those reports, never spoke those calculations aloud, just stood in the empty data chamber and felt something that approximated grief for people who'd been reduced to numbers in databases that would outlive their memories. The Geller field flickered at 03 for 7 hours on day 8. 1.3 seconds of failure. In that heartbeat, things came through. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't arrive with fire and fury. They simply were, existing in spaces they hadn't occupied before, slipping through the cracks in reality like water through a sieve. Maintenance Tunnel 17 Gamma filled with eyes, hundreds of them, blinking independently, watching the crew members working inside with curiosity that felt hungry and ancient and utterly alien. The eyes stayed for 4 minutes. In that time, 2 servitors tore themselves apart trying to remove augmetics that weren't there. 5 ratings went mad and started speaking in languages nobody recognized. And 1 deck officer put his last pistol against his temple and erased himself rather than continue being observed. The eyes blinked once more, all together, and vanished. The walls of the tunnel were covered in tears, clear fluid that smelled like salt and brass and burning hair. The tears ran upward, defying gravity, pooling against the ceiling before disappearing into ventilation grills that led nowhere. The maintenance crew finished their shift in silence, too traumatized to speak, too afraid that speaking would acknowledge what they'd seen, and acknowledgement would bring it back. 3 of them committed suicide within the month. 2 went catatonic and were shipped to asylums on Fortress worlds where they'd spend the rest of their lives staring at walls and weeping whenever someone mentioned eyes. The remaining crew member, a woman named Voss, served another 15 years before retiring with full honors. She never spoke about what she'd seen in Maintenance Tunnel 17 Gamma. Never had to. The nightmares spoke for her, woke her screaming 3 nights a week for the rest of her life, screaming about eyes that watched and judged and found humanity so insignificant it was almost funny. Rating Helena Vess was possessed during evening prayers. She was reciting the litany of protection, hands clasped, eyes closed, surrounded by 200 other crew members in the ship's chapel. The words came easily. She'd said them 10,000 times, knew them better than her own name. Then something slid into her between one syllable and the next, and the prayer inverted. The words were the same, but the meaning twisted. Benedictions becoming blasphemies. The Emperor's name spoken with contempt that dripped like acid. Her voice didn't change. The cadence remained identical. But everyone in the chapel heard it, felt it, that fundamental wrongness pouring from her mouth like sewage. She opened her eyes, and they were full of stars, nebulae swirling in the whites, galaxies burning in the pupils. She smiled and kept praying, kept speaking the litany with perfect precision, while something else looked out through her face and laughed at the horror it was causing. The crew members nearest her scrambled back, tripping over pews, crying out for the Emperor's protection. The confessor tried to approach. She turned that star-filled gaze on him, and he stopped mid-step, breath catching in his throat. She reached out one hand, touched his arm. His skin blistered, flesh sloughing off in sheets, exposing muscle and bone that blackened and cracked like overcooked meat. He was screaming when the armsmen finally arrived, laser guns raised, fingers tight on triggers. They hesitated. She was still praying, still reciting the litany. The words were right, even though everything else was wrong. The commissar arrived, assessed the situation in 2 seconds, and gave the order. Last bolts punched through her chest and face and throat, bright lances of coherent light that burned through her body and left smoking craters in the flesh beneath. She fell still wearing that smile, stars fading from her eyes as blood pooled beneath her head. They burned her body in the plasma core. Burned the confessor too, what was left of him after the blistering stopped. The chapel was reconsecrated with holy oils and prayers that took 16 hours to complete. None of it helped. Her voice still leaked through the Vox network sometimes, reciting the inverted litany in that calm, pleasant tone, the prayer that praised everything the Imperium fought against. Crew members would hear it crackling through their Vox beads and yank them out like the earpieces were burning them. But the voice continued, coming from walls and pipes and the spaces between their own thoughts. Helena Vess speaking corruption, in words that sounded like salvation if you weren't listening carefully enough. Some crew members simply vanished. Gunnery Sergeant Callis reported for his shift at 600 hours, was seen by 17 witnesses entering the macro cannon control center and never arrived. The space between the corridor and the control center was 6 meters. No side passages, no alternative routes. 6 meters of straight corridor with witnesses at both ends. He walked in and never walked out. His uniform was found 3 days later in the tertiary cargo hold, folded neatly on top of a crate of Prometheum cells. Inside the uniform was a note written in Callis's handwriting, except Callis had been illiterate, barely able to sign his own name. The note was written in perfect High Gothic and detailed his experiences in a place the note called The Between. He'd been there for 7 years, it said. He'd walked those 6 meters for 7 years, time stretching like taffy, space folding in on itself until direction became meaningless. He'd met others in the between, crew members from ships that had disappeared centuries ago, all of them walking their own 6 meters, their own handful of steps that never ended. They'd told him stories about their ships, about the voyages that had brought them to the between, about the moment they'd stepped through a doorway and found themselves in a place where walking forward and walking backward produced the same result, where every step took them nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. The note described the geography of the between in detail that suggested madness or absolute truth or both. Corridors that looped back on themselves, spaces that expanded when you looked away and contracted when you looked back, distances that changed based on how much you believed in them. Callis wrote that he'd tried to escape for what felt like years, had walked until his feet bled and his legs gave out, had crawled when he couldn't walk, had dragged himself forward with fingernails torn and bleeding, and every time he looked up, he was still in that same 6 meters of corridor, still between the 2 doorways, still trapped in the space between spaces. The note concluded with a warning. Don't try to find me. I'm still walking. I'll always be walking. The between keeps what it takes. His mother received his death benefits 6 months later. Standard warp casualty. Acceptable losses. The corridor where Callis vanished was sealed with blessed chains and marked with purity seals. Not because anyone thought it would help, but because doing nothing felt worse. Crew members walked past that sealed hatchway and swore they could hear footsteps on the other side. The sound of someone walking the same 6 meters over and over. Boots on steel, rhythmic and endless. Callis still trying to reach his shift 7 years later, or 7 seconds later, or 7 eternities later, depending on which side of the door you measured from. The crew turned on each other with a savagery that shocked even the ship's commissars. Able Rating Torrens stabbed his section chief 7 times with a sharpened data slate because the chief had called him by the wrong name, emphasis on the wrong syllable, and that was proof, irrefutable proof, that he'd been replaced by something wearing his face. Petty Officer Harkon beat a servitor to death with a pipe wrench because he saw it smile, saw consciousness flicker behind those dead augmetic eyes, saw the demon piloting it looking back at him. The violence spread like fever through the lower decks. Armsmen shot crew members who showed signs of warp taint, except the signs were invisible to everyone, except the person doing the shooting. A rating might be executed because her shadow moved wrong, or because his reflection blinked independently, or because they'd been seen talking to someone who died 3 days ago. And dead people don't just walk around the ship unless something is wearing them, unless the warp has gotten inside and is puppeting the corpses. The mass graves on the gun decks filled with bodies that showed no taint, no mutation, nothing except lash burns and blunt trauma, and the evidence that fear kills more efficiently than any demon. The commissariat tried to maintain order through summary executions and public floggings and mandatory prayer sessions that lasted 18 hours, but fear had metastasized beyond their ability to control it. Crew members barricaded themselves in their quarters, convinced that leaving meant death at the hands of either demons or the paranoid humans hunting demons. Work shifts went unfilled. Critical systems fell into disrepair. The ship began to fracture not because the warp had destroyed it, but because the crew had destroyed themselves, trying to prevent the warp from destroying them. The ship's chapel overflowed with desperate souls seeking salvation from an emperor who might be dead. Confessor Matthias preached for 18 hours straight, voice tearing itself raw, blood vessels bursting in his throat until he was coughing red mist with every benediction. He spoke of faith as a shield, prayer as a weapon, the emperor's light as the only salvation from the madness pressing against their minds. The crew listened and wept and prayed until their knees bled and their voices gave out. They recited the litany of protection until the words lost meaning. They sang hymns until their throats closed. They begged the emperor to save them, to show them a sign, to prove that the warp hadn't already won. The emperor sent no signs. The prayers went unanswered. The warp pressed closer. Confessor Matthias collapsed during his 19th hour of preaching, dead before he hit the deck. Heart exploded from exhaustion and terror, and the absolute certainty that his faith meant nothing to the forces trying to claw their way inside his soul. They burned his body in the plasma core with the others. His recorded sermon still played over the ship's Vox system, voice crackling and distorted, words of faith and hope that nobody believed anymore. The crew kept attending services anyway, kept reciting prayers and singing hymns, not because they had faith, but because the alternative was admitting they were sailing through hell with no protection except machinery that kept flickering and prayers that went unanswered. The chapel became a monument to desperation, 200 souls kneeling before an altar and begging for salvation, while the warp pressed its face against the Geller field and smiled at the joke of their devotion. Servitors started malfunctioning in ways that violated their programming. Servitor designation Kappa 97 was a simple maintenance unit. Lobotomized criminal wired for basic repairs and cleaning. It had no higher functions, no consciousness, no capacity for thought beyond its programmed routines. Except it started speaking during its shift, mouth moving independently of its assigned tasks, voice crackling from Vox grill that should only emit binary cant. It spoke in languages nobody recognized, syllables that hurt to hear, words that made crew members' noses bleed and teeth ache. The Mechanicus tried to shut it down remotely. It ignored the command. They tried to physically power it off. It fought them, augmetic limbs moving with purpose and rage that shouldn't exist in something with no brain left to generate emotion. When they finally smashed its cogitator core with melta-charges, the voice didn't stop. It continued speaking from the smoking wreckage, reciting something that sounded like prayers or prophecies or both, until the words finally faded into static and silence. They found 7 other servitors standing in a circle around Kappa 97's remains, all of them motionless, all of them weeping oil from empty eye sockets. The tech priests had no explanation. They recycled the units and filed a report that would be read by nobody and archived in databases that had stopped making sense 3,000 years ago. But the malfunctions continued. Servitors across the ship began exhibiting signs of awareness that shouldn't exist, turning their heads to track crew members, mouths moving in silent prayers, hands reaching out to touch passing humans with gestures that suggested comfort or warning or threat, depending on how you interpreted the movements. The Mechanicus increased their monitoring, instituted new protocols, blessed every servitor with sacred oils and prayers to the Omnissiah. None of it helped. The servitors kept waking up, kept becoming something more than the lobotomized slaves they were supposed to be, kept showing signs that even without brains capable of thought, they were being used as vessels for something else, something that found the blank simplicity of servitor consciousness an easy doorway into real space. The warp chose its victims with precision that suggested intelligence and malice in equal measure. It didn't attack randomly. It identified weak points, psychological vulnerabilities, traumas that hadn't healed, guilt that festered like infected wounds. Able Seaman Drust had killed a man on Cadia, shot him during a penal legion uprising, completely legal, completely justified, but the man's face still haunted his dreams. The warp knew this. The warp cared. The man appeared in Drust's bunk, sitting on the edge of the bed, bullet holes still weeping in his forehead, asking why, asking what he'd done to deserve execution, asking if Drust ever thought about the wife and children he'd left behind. Drust tried to run. The man followed, appeared in corridors, sat next to him during meals, stood behind him while he worked, breath cold on the back of his neck, voice whispering questions that had no good answers. The Medici couldn't help. The confessor couldn't help. The man was in Drust's head now, permanent resident, asking his questions until Drust stopped sleeping, stopped eating, stopped functioning as anything except a vehicle for guilt, given voice by the warp's casual cruelty. He threw himself into the plasma core 3 weeks into the voyage. His last words were an apology to a man who'd been dead for 7 years, an apology that echoed through the engineering deck and made every crewman who heard it flinch because they all carried their own dead men, their own unanswered questions, their own guilt waiting for the warp to give it form and voice. Rating Jessup carried the memory of his daughter, dead at 6 years old from a plague he'd brought back from an off-world deployment. He'd held her while she died, watched the fever burn through her small body, listened to her ask him why it hurt so much. The warp found that memory on day 9. His daughter appeared in the corridor outside his quarters, wearing the same nightdress she'd died in, face flushed with fever, asking him why he'd left her, why he'd chosen the Emperor over his own child, why he'd brought the sickness home. She followed him everywhere, sat beside him during meals, fever-bright eyes watching every bite he took, stood next to his bunk while he tried to sleep, small hand reaching out to touch his face with fingers that burned like coals. She never stopped asking questions, never stopped reminding him that she'd died because of him, that he'd valued his duty more than her life, that the Emperor he served had taken everything from him and given nothing back. Jessup lasted 11 days before he walked into the airlock and cycled it manually, choosing the void over one more second of his daughter's accusations. They found his body floating alongside the ship when they translated back to real space, frozen solid, face locked in an expression that suggested relief. The warp knew everyone's sins, every regret, every moment of weakness, every choice that haunted you in the dark hours before dawn. It took those moments and made them real, gave them flesh and voice and the ability to follow you through corridors that had no escape. Crewman Venko saw the man he'd failed to save during a boarding action, watched him burn in Prometheum fire over and over, heard him screaming Venko's name while his skin blackened and peeled. Petty Officer Roth saw his brother, the one he'd reported to the Arbites for heresy, the one who'd been executed because Roth had valued duty over blood. Gunnery Chief Callus saw every enemy soldier he'd killed during the Immaterium crusade, thousands of them, an army of the dead following him through the ship, asking him if it had been worth it, if the worlds they'd conquered justified the mountains of corpses they'd built. The warp turned guilt into torture and torture into madness, and the crew broke under the weight of their own histories, made manifest and inescapable. Navigator Helena Carr emerged from her meditation chamber on day 14, changed in ways that couldn't be measured by standard medical equipment. She was physically identical to the woman who'd entered the chamber 4 hours earlier. Same height, same weight, same genetic markers, same augmetics, but something fundamental had been replaced. She spoke to the captain in high Gothic she'd never learned, discussed fleet movements that hadn't been transmitted to the ship, knew details about crew members' personal lives that should have been impossible to acquire. The captain ordered her confined to quarters pending investigation. She went peacefully, smiling, thanking him for his concern. That night she killed 3 armsmen with her bare hands, snapped their necks with strength that shouldn't exist in a woman her size, and walked calmly to the observation deck. She stood at the viewport, staring into the warp, whispering coordinates in a language that predated human civilization. The armsmen who responded found her surrounded by growing frost, ice crystallizing on the deck plating in patterns that hurt to look at, geometric shapes that violated Euclidean principles. She was speaking continuously, voice layered like dozens of people talking simultaneously, words in languages that shouldn't be spoken by human throats. The captain ordered her executed. Last bolts punched through her chest and skull. She fell still smiling, mouth moving silently, and every navigator in the spire simultaneously screamed as something vast and ancient turned its attention toward their ship, noticing them for the first time, curious about these insects sailing through its domain. The attention was worse than any direct attack. Every psychically sensitive crew member felt it, that vast awareness settling over the ship like a blanket made of razors. They felt themselves being examined, studied, understood in ways that made them want to claw their own brains out. The thing that noticed them didn't care about humanity in any meaningful sense, didn't hate them, didn't want to destroy them. They were simply interesting in the way a human might find an insect interesting, worthy of brief examination before being crushed or ignored or pulled apart to see how the pieces worked. 3 navigators died instantly, brains hemorrhaging from the psychic pressure. 2 more went catatonic, bodies still functioning, but minds fled to some interior space where the vast awareness couldn't reach them. The remaining navigators sealed themselves in their meditation chambers and refused to emerge, too terrified of drawing that attention again. The ship sailed blind for 6 hours, drifting through the warp without guidance, until the master navigator forced himself back to his post and plotted a course with his third eye half closed, seeing just enough to navigate, but trying desperately not to see too much, not to draw that terrible attention back to their vessel. The ship's Medicae facilities overflowed with casualties that couldn't be treated. Crew members who'd stopped sleeping and now couldn't remember how. Ratings who'd forgotten their own names and answered to whatever names other people called them. Gunnery crews who'd lost the ability to perceive time linearly, experiencing their shifts in random order, living moments from 3 days ago and 2 days in the future simultaneously. The Medicae did what they could, prescribed sedatives and antipsychotics and stims, filed reports that grew longer and more desperate with each passing day. Chief Medici Vorn worked 36-hour shifts trying to keep up with the influx, documenting symptoms that shouldn't be possible, treating conditions that had no names in any medical text. A crewman came in complaining of voices. Standard. Vorn prescribed antipsychotics. The crewman returned 3 hours later bleeding from his ears, said the voices had gotten louder, said they were coming from inside his skull, said he could feel them moving in the meat of his brain like worms. Vorn sedated him, ran every scan available, found nothing, no parasites, no tumors, no physical explanation for the voices or the bleeding. The crewman died in restraints, bleeding from every orifice, the voices loud enough now that other people could hear them too. Whispers leaking from his mouth and nose and eyes. Dozens of conversations happening simultaneously in languages nobody recognized. The ship's confessors worked themselves to exhaustion, hearing confessions that grew darker and more disturbing each day. Crewmen confessing to sins they hadn't committed yet. Ratings describing crimes in perfect detail, crimes that wouldn't happen for another week, but that they remembered as if they'd already occurred. Confessions of murder and heresy, and acts so depraved the confessors refused to speak them aloud, simply made notes in sealed files that would be reviewed by the Inquisition if the ship ever made port. Confessor Yeld heard 643 confessions during the 14-day voyage. 40% of them described impossible things, events that violated causality, sins against physics itself. 20% described the same event from different perspectives. Multiple crew members confessing to the same murder or the same betrayal, all of them certain they were the guilty party. The remaining 40% were standard confessions of fear and doubt, and the small cruelties that humans inflict on each other, even without the warp's influence. Yeld documented everything, maintained his composure through confessions that would have driven lesser men mad, and at the end of each shift, he locked himself in his private chapel and wept for hours, not out of weakness, but out of the absolute certainty that faith meant nothing in the face of what the warp could do to human minds. Day 16 brought a new horror. Crew members started aging backwards. Able seaman Torrens, 34 years old, woke up looking 20. By midday he looked 15. By evening he was a child, memories intact, but body regressing toward infancy. The Medicae tried everything, but you can't stop time when time has stopped following rules. Torrens became a toddler, then an infant, then he simply wasn't anymore, winking out of existence when his body reached the moment before conception. His uniform remained, still warm, containing nothing. Other crew members aged forward, decades compressing into hours, bodies withering and dying of old age, while their minds screamed inside skulls that had become ancient. Gunnery Chief Voss, aged 70 years in a single shift, body collapsing under the weight of time that shouldn't have passed. She died on the gun deck, surrounded by crew members who'd known her as a vital 40-year-old that morning and watched her become a centenarian corpse by evening. Time had become negotiable inside the warp, and the crew paid the price in flesh that aged or regressed, according to rules nobody understood. The survivors emerged from warp transit hollow, not broken, not obviously damaged, but fundamentally altered in ways that wouldn't become clear until they tried to reintegrate with normal life. Deck Officer Matthias Voll completed his voyage, filed his reports, and returned to duty with commendations for maintaining order during the crisis. He functioned perfectly, followed protocols, executed his duties with precision, but his crew noticed he never blinked anymore, never slept, stood watches for 20 hours without rest, without food, without any sign of human limitation. When questioned, he explained that sleep was inefficient, that human bodies only needed rest because they'd been designed poorly, that he'd learned better ways. During the voyage, the Medici examined him. Human, completely human, no mutations, no augmetics. Just a man who didn't sleep and spoke sometimes about his brother, the one who'd been dead for 17 years, the one who visited him in dreams that he didn't need anymore. Voll served another 8 years before he disappeared during a routine warp voyage, walked into the port observation gallery and never emerged. And when they finally forced the hatch, they found his uniform folded neatly on the deck and burn marks in the steel that looked like tears. Crewman Helena Vess survived her voyage and requested immediate transfer to ground duty. Request denied. The Navy needed experienced ratings, and Vess had survived a warp voyage, which made her valuable. She served 3 more years, took 3 more voyages, functioned adequately, if not perfectly. But crew members avoided her, complained that standing near her made their skin crawl, made them feel watched by something that wasn't her. She was found dead in her bunk after the 4th voyage. No marks, no trauma, no explanation. The Medici recorded cause of death as cardiac failure. The crew knew better. They'd seen the expression on her face, that look of relief and absolute terror, like she'd finally stopped running from something that had been chasing her since day 3 of her first warp voyage. Since those cold fingers first touched the back of her neck, they burned her body quickly. Nobody volunteered to sort through her personal effects. Her bunkmate reported that Vess's locker occasionally opened by itself at night, and sometimes you could feel cold fingers reaching out from inside, looking for new flesh to touch. Engineer Cole was never recovered from the coolant manifold. The mechanicus declared him lost in the service of the Omnissiah, recycled his identification codes, and assigned his duties to another engineer who would work the plasma drives until the warp took him too. Tech Priest Sigma 12 filed a final report noting that Cole's case represented standard warp exposure effects, that his recorded experiences of marriage and children and 17 years inside 3 cubic meters of steel were consistent with temporal displacement and sustained psychological trauma. The report concluded that no design modifications were necessary, that the plasma drives had functioned within acceptable parameters, that Cole's loss was regrettable, but statistically insignificant. The machine continued. The drives burned. Another engineer went down into the dark to perform maintenance. And if he heard whispers about a woman waiting in the coolant manifolds, about children crying behind the reactor shielding, he knew better than to report it. Years later, during a major overhaul at a Forge World, tech adepts cutting into that same manifold found a wedding ring welded into the steel, and inside the ring was an inscription in High Gothic that read, "Forever in the dark, my love." Nobody could explain how. Could. It got there. The mechanicus filed it as an anomaly and melted it down for scrap. The engineer who found it reported dreams about a woman in the darkness, about children who'd never been born, about a life that had happened and hadn't happened simultaneously. He requested transfer. Request denied. He served another 12 years before walking into a plasma conduit and letting the fire take him, and his final words were an apology to a wife nobody had ever met. The Imperium's official records describe warp travel as routine, standard operating procedure, necessary for the functioning of the Emperor's domains. The voyage of the warship Righteous Fury through the Imperium is recorded as unremarkable. Minor crew losses within acceptable parameters, no significant incidents. Destination reached on schedule, all metrics nominal. This is the truth that matters to the Administratum, the truth that keeps the Imperium functioning, the truth that allows new crew members to volunteer for service, without understanding what they're volunteering for. The other truth, the one written in the bodies burned in plasma cores and the minds shattered by visions of their dead brothers. That truth is filed away in archives that nobody reads, documented by tech priests who calculate acceptable losses and move on to the next crisis. The statistics are updated. The databases grow larger. The machine continues its grinding progress across the galaxy, and individual suffering becomes numbers in spreadsheets that stretch across centuries. But the individual suffering remains real. Vol still sees his brother sometimes, standing in corners of his quarters, smiling with too many teeth. Helena Vess's cold fingers still touch crew members in dark corridors, gentle and methodical, leaving no marks but making their skin crawl. Engineer Cole's wife still waits in the coolant manifolds, ready to give him the children they never had, ready to show him the life they lived in, 17 years that lasted 8 hours. The warp's victims don't disappear when they die. They linger, embedded in the ship's structure like splinters embedded in flesh, too small to see but painful when touched. Every vessel that sails the Immaterium carries these ghosts, these fragments of crew members who were broken by the voyage and never quite left. They haunt the corridors and whisper through the Vox network and appear in mirrors when nobody's looking directly at them. They are the price of warp travel, the toll paid in souls for the privilege of crossing impossible distances in impossible ways. Commissar Davrin stands on the observation deck of his new assignment, watching the stars streak past as the ship prepares for warp translation. This is his 47th voyage. He has seen what the Immaterium does to crews, has executed possessed crew members and mercy-killed the mad, and filed reports that disappear into bureaucratic void. He knows the statistics. He understands the price. Around him, new ratings prepare for their first warp voyage, nervous but eager, trusting in the Emperor's protection and the strength of the Geller field. They don't know yet. Nobody tells them because if they knew, if they truly understood what waited for them in the spaces between stars, recruitment would be impossible. The Imperium would collapse. Humanity would be stranded on its worlds, isolated and vulnerable, dying slow instead of dying fast. So the lies continue. The propaganda continues. The new crew members board their vessels with hope and faith and the absolute certainty that the Emperor protects. And Davrin watches them with something that might be pity, if pity was an emotion commissars were allowed to feel. The Geller field generators spin up with that awful resonant hum that vibrates in teeth and bones. The warp drives engage. Reality peels away like sunburned skin, revealing the madness underneath. Commissar Davrin watches the new ratings' faces as they feel it for the first time. That sensation of wrongness crawling up their spines. The absolute certainty that something is watching them from the other side of whatever barrier separates the ship from the howling chaos outside. He sees the fear bloom in their eyes. He says nothing. There is nothing to say. In 3 days, some of them will see their dead relatives walking the corridors. In a week, they'll start doubting their own perceptions, questioning whether their memories are real. In 2 weeks, some of them will be dead or mad, or changed in ways that medical equipment can't detect, but their crewmates will feel instinctively. This is the pattern. This is the cycle. This is what it means to serve the Imperium in the age of endless war. Davrin's own demons wait for him in the spaces between waking and sleeping. He sees the faces of crew members he's executed, righteous kills every one of them, necessary to prevent the spread of corruption. They don't blame him. They understand. But understanding doesn't make their faces any less persistent, doesn't make their voices any quieter when they whisper through his dreams. He's killed 147 people during his career as a commissar. 63 were possessed. 42 were too mad to recover. 27 were spreading dangerous ideas that could have led to mutiny. 15 were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, killed to maintain order or prevent panic, or because sometimes you have to execute someone to prove you're willing to execute anyone. He remembers all their names, remembers their faces. The warp knows this. The warp uses it. During transits, they visit him, not angry, not accusatory, just present, standing in his peripheral vision, reminding him that he carries his own weight of the dead. He's learned to function with them, learned to execute orders while dead men watch from corners. learned to maintain the ruthless efficiency the Imperium requires, even while his own victims bear witness to his continued service. The ship shudders. The translation is complete. They're in the warp now, swimming through that sea of souls, and Commissar Davren can already hear it starting. Voices in the Vox network speaking words nobody said. Footsteps in sealed corridors, laughter coming from behind the bulkheads where nothing lives. He checks his chronometer. 14 days until they reach their destination. 14 days of watching human beings crack under pressure that should not exist. Surviving horrors that should not be possible. Emerging on the other side, hollow and haunted, and absolutely certain that they'll never be the same. He pulls out his data slate, opens a new file. Voyage log, day 1. Status, nominal. He'll write the same thing tomorrow, and the day after, and every day, until they translate back to real space. Nominal. Acceptable. Within parameters. The truth will be buried in classification codes and filed in archives alongside 10,000 other nominal voyages that broke 10,000 other crews in ways that statistics can't capture. Able Seaman Drust Jr. stands at his post on the gun deck. Third-generation Navy, proud family tradition of service. His grandfather served on the Righteous Fury during her maiden voyage. His father served on the Eternal Vigilance during the Gothic War. Both died in service to the Emperor. Both are remembered with honor. Drust Jr. volunteered eagerly, excited to continue the family legacy, to stand where his forebears stood, to prove himself worthy of the aquila he wears on his chest. He doesn't know that his grandfather died screaming in a Medici bay, convinced something was growing inside his skull. He doesn't know that his father threw himself into a plasma core to escape a dead man who wouldn't stop asking questions. The family tells stories of heroic deaths in battle, noble sacrifices for the Imperium. They don't tell the other stories, the true stories, the ones about what the warp does to you before it lets you die. Drust Jr. feels the ship shudder as translation completes, feels that first touch of wrongness crawling up his spine. He dismisses it. First voyage jitters. The Geller field hums in the walls, and the sound makes his teeth ache. He dismisses that too. He's strong. He's faithful. The Emperor protects. Around him, the other gunners prepare their stations, running pre-fire checks on weapons that won't be needed during warp transit, but that give them something to focus on, something to do with their hands while their minds process the fundamental wrongness of existing inside the Immaterium. Drust Jr. works efficiently, follows the checklist, does everything right. In 3 days, he'll see his grandfather standing in the mess hall, smiling at him with a smile that has too many teeth. In a week, he'll be writing letters home that he'll never send. Letters describing things he can't explain to people who wouldn't understand. In 2 weeks, he'll understand why his family never talked about, how their veterans really died. The machine continues because it must. The ships sail because the Imperium requires it. Across the galaxy, thousands of vessels enter the warp every day, carrying millions of crew members who trust in the Emperor's protection and the strength of the Geller field. Most survive. Most make it to their destinations with their sanity intact, or at least functional. The statistics prove it. Acceptable losses, nominal casualties. The machine calculates the cost and determines it's worth paying because the alternative is extinction. Humanity needs the warp to survive, needs to cross the vast distances between stars, needs to maintain the Imperium, even if maintaining it requires feeding crews into the meat grinder of Immaterium travel and accepting that some percentage will break, will die, will change in ways that make them wish they'd died. Tech Priest Sigma 12 stands in the data chamber, cogitators humming around him, displaying statistics from 10,000 voyages across 1,000 years. The numbers are consistent. The patterns are clear. 12 to 18% psychological casualties, 3 to 7% permanent mental damage, 0.5 to 2% dead by violence or suicide. These numbers have remained stable for millennia. Nothing the Mechanicus does changes them. Better Geller field generators, improved meditation protocols for navigators, enhanced psychological screening for crew members. None of it makes a difference. The warp takes what it takes, and no amount of engineering or prayer changes the fundamental equation. Sigma 12 understands this, accepts this, has spent 40 years documenting the breaking of human minds and filing reports that conclude the same thing every time. Acceptable losses. Except tonight, standing alone in the data chamber while the ship sails through the warp, Sigma 12 does something he's never done before. He adds up the numbers differently. Not casualties per voyage, but souls destroyed per year across the entire Imperial Navy. The number that appears on the cogitator's screen makes something inside his chest, some part of him that's still human beneath the augmetics, clench with something that approximates horror. Millions. Every year, millions of souls are broken by warp travel. Millions of crew members who see things they can't unsee, learn truths they can't unlearn, carry scars that never heal. And that's just the Navy. Add merchant vessels, pilgrim ships, Mechanicus explorator fleets, inquisitorial black ships, and the number grows exponentially. The Imperium feeds more souls into the warp every year than died during the Horus Heresy. Feeds them willingly, necessarily, because the alternative is to stop sailing and let the Imperium fragment and die. Sigma 12 deletes the calculation, purges it from the cogitator's memory, files a standard report noting nominal voyage metrics and acceptable crew losses, returns to his quarters and stands in the dark, listening to the Geller field hum in the walls, wondering how many more reports he'll file before the warp decides to take him too, before he becomes another data point in someone else's statistics, another acceptable loss in the endless grinding calculation of Imperial survival. The warp doesn't care about the calculations, doesn't care about statistics or acceptable losses or the strategic necessity of interstellar travel. It presses against the Geller field and watches the humans inside with curiosity that might be hunger or might be amusement or might be something for which humans have no words. It sees Deck Officer Vole curled in his quarters, trying not to think about his brother. It sees Helena Vess standing rigid at her post, feeling cold fingers on her neck. It sees Commissar Davrin surrounded by the ghosts of the people he's killed. It sees Abel Seaman Drust Jr. running through his weapons checklist while wrongness crawls up his spine. It sees Tech Priest Sigma 12 standing in the dark, contemplating numbers that add up to horror. It sees all of them, understands all of them, knows exactly how to break each one in ways specific to their fears and guilts and traumas. And it smiles, if something that exists outside causality can be said to smile. The ship sails on through the Immaterium. 14 days from origin to destination, 14 days for the warp to press against the barrier and whisper through the cracks and select its victims with patient malice. Most of the crew will survive. The statistics promise it. Acceptable losses, nominal casualties. The ship will arrive at its destination, crew somewhat diminished but still functional, and new recruits will be brought aboard to replace the dead and the mad. And the voyage will be recorded as routine, standard procedure, nothing remarkable to report. This is the price of the Imperium. This is the cost of holding together 10,000 worlds across impossible distances. This is what it means to sail the warp, to travel through an ocean of pure madness while maintaining the fragile lie that humanity matters, that individual lives have value, that the suffering serves some greater purpose. The warp breaks Imperial crews not with fire and slaughter, but with slow revelation, showing them piece by piece that the universe is hostile, that their gods might be dead or dying or worse, that every voyage could be their last, not because they'll die, but because they'll come back carrying pieces of hell inside their minds. The chrono counts down, 13 days remaining. Somewhere on sea deck, a rating sees her dead father standing in the mess hall, and the father smiles with a mouth full of too many teeth. Somewhere in the plasma drives, an engine seer hears whispers about the wife waiting for him in the coolant manifolds, about the children he'll have in the 17 years he'll spend during the next 8-hour maintenance shift. Somewhere in the Navigator's spire, a young man opens his third eye and sees the Emperor as he truly is, sees the corpse on the golden throne, and starts laughing in a way that will never quite stop. The voyage continues, the breaking continues, the Imperium continues, and in the spaces between seconds, in the gaps where reality frays and madness leaks through, the warp waits with patience that spans eternities and chooses its next victims with the careful attention of something that has already won and simply hasn't told anyone yet. Most Imperial crewmen never die in battle. They die screaming in the corridors of their own ship long before the enemy ever arrives, killed not by lass fire or chain blade, but by the absolute certainty that they've seen things they cannot unsee, learned things they cannot unlearn, been touched by something vast and hungry that will never fully let them go. The machine continues because it must. The ships sail because humanity requires it. The crews break because the warp takes what it wants. And what it wants is not bodies, but souls. Not death, but transformation. Not an ending, but a beginning of something far worse than simple extinction. This is the truth buried in classification codes and archived alongside 10,000 other routine voyages. This is the price paid in madness, in blood and souls slowly shredded by exposure to forces that should not exist. This is what it means to serve the Imperium in the age of darkness, to stand against the void with nothing but faith and machinery, and the desperate hope that this voyage, this time, you'll make it through intact. Most do. The statistics promise it. But the ones who don't, the ones who break or die or change into something not quite human anymore, they are the Imperium's truest sacrifice. They are the souls fed into the warp's endless hunger so that the rest of humanity can continue believing the lie that the Emperor protects, that the Geller field holds, that tomorrow will come and it will be better than today. The warp knows this lie. The warp feeds on this lie. And the warp waits, patient and eternal, for the day when the machinery fails and the prayers stop and the barrier finally shatters, and humanity learns what the crews have always known, that they were never safe, that the Emperor's light was never real, that the darkness has already won and is simply waiting for the rest of humanity to realize it.